Thank you. That was fun.
Is this yours?
That is not mine.
Then I'm going to take it.
I can answer those questions, though. Let me just pop up a presentation. The first thing Al asks me is, did you make new drawings? No, I didn't. You get someone else to do it. Okay, do you guys have signal? So my name's Chris, and I thought that the best way to start this talk was to show the last slide of the talk I did earlier this year. In the UK, I kind of wanted to talk about all the massive changes that have been happening, and to really look at, kind of the intrinsic and the extrinsic kind of aspects of that, how it affects us personally, how we're looking at things that could be very frightening, disruptive technologies that could, risk our skills, our capabilities. So I tend to really look, inwardly about change, which is probably why I embrace it. So today I actually thought it made sense to kind of continue on that vein, but really look at it more from my designer background, how that has really affected my process. And I actually could not have even thought of a better situation than to have John and Roni talking about the very same kind of topics that I hold dear to my heart. So I thought this was clever to talk about design where it matters most. And I called this talk that because I used to have a very specific thought of what design was. I even had this mental image of what a designer should look like and the type of projects they should be involved in and those that they should not be involved in because they're too creative for it. So that's kind of where my journey began. So what I like to do now always is to break down the root. And I just pulled out 3 definitions. You can all read, but I think they're kind of cool because one would argue that all those definitions are really the same in many ways. And probably the most important one is the last one is just to think, right? Just get your head out of your ass and think sometimes. Yes, that's true. Never used that little droplet, but it was appropriate. I always focused on the creative side of my life. That's how I decided to go into industrial design. I was torn between architecture as well as other design and fine art type of programs. And as I learned, as I developed as a student and then as a designer and then going into high tech, that you really kind of had to have multiple droplets going around. And these are 3 primary ones that I learned very early. You can be really creative, but you have to be able to balance that with the technical aspects. You have to have technical skills, and your ability to execute has to be in reality. And the business requirements are critical. You kind of can't do anything, especially having a job without delivering to specific requirements. So when you map this out, those ripples naturally, they're ripples because they overlap and they have interference and all this cool stuff happens. I've been really surprised for myself of how much my shift of focus has moved really across all of it. These days, I tend to spend more time on the business side of what companies do, why they're doing it. And the creative side tends to be the North Star that helps me confidently help them in that process. And the fact that I can technically execute or speak to the go-to market or other aspects, I am often a trusted person to help in these spaces. So I don't just say, here's some strategy and see you later. I tend to be involved because I care. I recently took stock of my life because someone asked me, and I couldn't really do it from the LinkedIn perspective. When you go like, oh, what did I do? And you look at your LinkedIn and you go, how successful have I been because of the companies I worked for? So what I did is I started mapping myself out against the kind of the personal milestones. And just like, what you heard from other speakers, when I was a kid, there was a lot of things I liked to do. I liked to draw. I liked to play. I loved sci-fi. really influenced by all these things that were really new and fresh at the time. So I studied design, and as I parallel these activities through my life, what's interesting is they really start blurring. I never expected to work at a tech company. I expected to work at an OEM. I expected to work on products or fashion or something like that, more the consumer product side than the actual technology. And what's interesting is being at a company like Alias at the time, my value didn't end up being that I could use the software or speak to it. I ended up having to do things like interpret what they thought the customer wanted. And that kind of started leading me towards both a marketing vein as well as a UX design vein. I mean, before UX was a thing. And then because I did that, they would force me to make their PowerPoint slides. So I'd have to be sitting here in meetings making their goddamn PowerPoint slides. Best thing ever, because as a young, an intern or as I don't know, I don't even call myself, just junior, all of a sudden you're involved in a company's strategy. You actually ask them, I don't get this slide. And then I realized something really incredible. They were really concerned that I didn't get it. And of course, I was able to work with really great people, giants, and I learned a lot from them. So anyhow, as I grow in myself, I get exposed to different things, and I really can't distinguish these two ends. I actually think the personal side is more interesting because I only started mentoring people because you have people reporting to you, so you start mentoring and then you become somebody who guides their future. And at some point, I really realized that I just needed to try things, and that's why I left corporations. I love the problems that companies have, and I love being part of a family. But at the same time, you get really good at also being good at the family. You become a fixture. You're really good at hacking that system. I need budget for this. Let me suck up to this guy. So I actually broke away and decided to do my own thing. And what was awesome was I became an accidental consultant, and I think that's kind of why I'm here. As an accidental consultant, I've been asked to solve problems for companies that I didn't know that I was capable of because I always thought that I was in the design and high-tech space. Manufacturing, M&E, but what the reality is my first client was in healthcare. They had some technology that they acquired through a clinic purchase, and I was asked to look at it because they didn't know what they had. And that kind of really started this natural flow of hanging out with people and just chatting about problems and then being asked if I could spend a few hours. So I touched on industries that I didn't think I would ever get into. Healthcare, alternative energy, still having a connection to, BIM and AEC and stuff like that, still having connections into visualization, into manufacturing. So all of those things were there, but I looked at them very differently. I looked at them from a very objective perspective. Anyhow, I'll get into some more details about what I've also tried to do for fun, which really should be on the personal side, but the funny thing is stuff just kind of keeps moving, stage left. So let's kind of look at this. Since I hang out with a lot of people that are either entrepreneurs or startups, I've been hearing this a lot: fake it till you make it. And I remember at first feeling wow, that's kind of feels yucky. I think it's really neat because there's a lot of kind of cognitive behavior kind of ties to this. It really relates to the whole, being optimistic, being able to change your thoughts so that your emotions can help you get the behavior done, or you repeat the behavior so that you feel like you're more emotionally in tune. I find that fascinating, but I actually think that my design background, I think all of your backgrounds in whether it's kind of creative or whether it's process oriented or whether it's systems, I think that is kind of why this seems weird to me. So I did Google search and I grabbed just a variety of process type images. And I just wanted to do this because I think this is really cool. I think it's really cool. I'm not here to say whether something's right or true. I think it's really amazing to see all of these different processes, even the ones that are familiar, but as well as the ones that are totally not. How a film company might have a different process than diagnosing a sick person. And yet the graphs themselves, when we just put a Gaussian blur over all of this, they're all roughly the same. Whether you're talking about marketing, whether you're talking about developers, whether you're talking about engineering and design processes, as well as talking about what you need to actually get to your business model, right? The business canvas is a really interesting exercise. This one I think is really interesting because I had actually a number of really good conversations with people after my talk in March, because everyone was talking about design thinking. And this is what a lot of people in business talk to me about. And I think it's really cool because the design literacy, even though it's foreign to them, even though they get this kind of rudimentary, and it's a true process, as all the other ones are as well, I think it's really amazing that people start understanding this whole process of trying to understand their problem, finding the problem, defining it, and then doing stuff to solve it, and then test it, and then, of course, what happens when everyone knows design? It doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't mean that there's good design, doesn't mean that products are successful. But the process tends to explode and tends to have a lot of different inputs and outputs. So, as we know, many of the products that you guys do, you have to have so many different streams. You have to have software developers working in tandem with your engineers, with product designers separately, as well as 2 freelance writers. And all of these are things that you end up having to brief, you end up having to scope, and you end up having to deploy. And not everybody is going to be at the same level, right? So you have to create different types of briefs to get different deliverables, and then you have to, like an air traffic controller, you kind of have to coordinate all this shit to kind of come together. And they don't come together at the same time, which is why I thought that all of this is one sword, but the sword isn't fully formed. And this is the cool part about processes, because we also figure out what we need to launch, MVP, what we don't need. You make it work. So from a design perspective, I like to think of it like an onion skin. As a consultant, I get pulled in, and I never know where they're going to drop me in that onion skin. If they want me to write some copy, then I'm pretty much on the outside. But really quickly, what I've been discovering is that it's actually really fascinating to apply it anywhere. So the same processes really fit anywhere. And my early exposure to executives worrying about their pitches, to worrying about the pixels of an icon, that's a range that I really appreciate that I've been exposed to. I feel that when I'm given a problem, the only reason I don't freak out and go like, I can't do that, is because I rely on this aspect that, not that I know a process, but that I am confident that I can make one up that works in the situation that I'm in. And that's really important, because think of it. When you join a company and you're saying like you have the best process in the world, and you tell everyone to listen to me, I'm the best, I don't know, that might work. But the reality is that's not always a condition that any of us are going to get. So to me, being able to understand all of those constraints and the human constraints, because as we know, often our worst enemies are some of our allies that we're supposed to be working with. So you have to understand how that dynamic is going to be and how it actually affects a process. Because if you'd ignore it, you just have some assholes that are doing something else when you all said you were doing this really cool. Hey, but we had this awesome scrum and we all agreed. Fuck. So this is the stuff that I think is cool. What I think is cool is that people can sit down and they can draw branches and they can think of ideas and they can offshoot, and it's an evolution. It's a which way book that's not really like a redo. It's a which way book because we live our lives every day. There's branches. And I equated it to, this is actually from I think a medical journal I put, it's just a schematic of creating a decision tree for a diagnosis. It doesn't matter what it is, you start somewhere and you end up somewhere else. So these are the things I think are really cool. We all have this kind of power to be able to build the process. And I think that's really important because otherwise it's really easy to be overwhelmed and feel helpless. So that's where I think design, for me, has made the biggest difference in I don't know, call it confidence or call it wisdom. Another aspect of design, which I think is key, and we just heard this in John and Ronnie's talk, the whole aspect of fun and imagination and design. And I know that that stuff is like really, you know, it's ethereal. But I think it's really important, and this is stuff why people need to create. And I think the act of being a designer and no longer seeing those barriers makes me feel that every domain is open. I just have to choose whether I feel like launching a medical app tomorrow, whether I feel like making a comic book, whether I feel like producing a movie. And these are things that drove me nuts because I haven't been able to do that, right? How come I can't direct a movie? Well, that's not really what I want to do. I want to see these worlds happen, and this is where I'm discovering that world building, right? We've been hearing about it in a few of the discussions. World building is really fascinating because world building means you create the context and all of the elements in that world, and then you start getting more things in that world. So what's really interesting, I know I can't build a future world. I'll never be able to afford it. I'll never be able to. However, it's in an interesting random conversation, sports ended up being something that was really interesting to me. So I wanted to share with you one of my projects because I think it's applicable to how I have managed to use, I think, design thinking to apply it to things that I actually think are really designed, but to most of you, it'll read as M&E. Like, oh, but what's weird is I don't see it that way. And I'll explain why. I decided to make the ESPN of the future, meaning I would create news that happens in parallel 60 years in the future to our day today, and that I would get real writers and sports writers to write about it. Why? Why? Because I think sports is an interesting market. It's huge. It's like $2.7 trillion just on the sports side, not including all the other stuff like the fashion and the footwear. But it became this objective thing, because I don't love sports. I watch it. I don't love it. But it became this thing which I could tell a story about a future that restricted the context. As a self-funded project, I can't go and just hire like ILM to do like 13 seconds, 4 shots of 13 seconds. I needed to find a way that I could make something that I could explore, that every dollar that I committed into it helped build the world. So that really liberated me, actually. And in fact, when I realized how much writers and artists were going to cost, and designers and engineers who were helping me out, because everyone needs to be paid, right? I realized that I had to scope it down even more. So I decided that I couldn't run a whole season, that maybe I would just do the playoffs. And then I would also do it on Mars, because that would change the context, right? And Mars is hot. We know that science ranks higher than entertainment, and science is a thing. It's it's popular. So it mashed, from a business perspective, all these things that are interesting, and it let me kind of play with this idea. So it's kind of a process, but not really. So what if I designed some stuff, but I didn't draw anything? What if I made the context? What if I made a framework, and then I had some of my friends who are developers build an engine that actually would generate it? Because sports are important. Sports are non-deterministic. There's no good and evil, and at the end of the movie, the evil guy loses and the good guy wins. So to keep that, I realized I had to build a simulator, right? So we've been talking about, world simulation, like all these VR things. How do you do it on the cheap? So I had to create a new sport that worked with the conditions of a planet that I had to research. And then I had to create a season schedule. I had to create the roster and all the players. And then that was fed in by these developers who are game developers, and they were shocked that I wanted them to just create the generator and no game. They go, you want to, it just takes the statistics and it just generates them and captures the statistics again? I went, yes. And can you give me a ticker tape of what happened? And then those ticker tape goes to the writers. And the writers have been reading these things of possession times and who shot and who scored. But anyhow, it's cool because then they had to pass it on to some artists that would just look at this stuff, refer to some of the design context, and then they would draw roughly what these things looked like. Just like the news of the 1900s. It made me laugh, and that's why it was a project I had to do. So, and how cool would it be for that the audience could actually kind of feed back into the system, and then eventually I would also put products because there's branches. The cool thing about sports is it's all about brands. People wear it, people live it, people read those little notification things all day long, and this is why it's interesting. I have no belief that I can necessarily pull this off, except for the fact that my measurement of what is successful about this is that I can do it. That we live in a time that I can actually get some of the artists from ILM guys to contribute thoughts. I can get some of the top artists that work at Marvel or other properties to contribute to this. That I can get a guy who designed subs to draw the schematics. That some of these things really should work. That I really get off on that. So here's the process, the ideation part. I had to start off, and I had some artists do some crazy environmentals. What could this all look like? And how would people live? So maybe they'd have to dig under because the radiation's so crappy there. And then, we started kind of plotting out, and then we realized we had to go down the rabbit hole. So we had to use more of our design skills. We had to use more of our research. We had to find more information. How would they eat? Well, the AeroFarm stuff is super awesome. Totally, the yields are high. And I had to even figure out, okay, well, we're gonna have to suck some types of atmosphere, and then, so we actually had these talks that they weren't reminiscent of design. I was working with engineers and analysts, and we were doing this, and we were behaving as though these were real things that needed to be built. And then I had to realize that I had to build out a whole population graph. I had to model out, knowing what we know, and what countries were going into space, of who might land, and then what the population would be, so that I could even have a league, right? How many colonies did I need to have enough population to have a league? That was actually super fun. Because it started building the lore. The lore was, okay, well, why am I picking football? And when I mean football, I mean soccer, or football in your case. I had to actually dig into that lore of going, when was the first football kicked? So those first explorers, bored out of their mind, duct tape up a ball and they kick it. And just like that first Shepard, golf shot on the moon, I needed to put the date that happened. Meanwhile, artists were drawing what every character that we generated had to look like, because I needed all that reference. So it was bizarre. I'm creating all the pieces of what you normally would have in a game, but it's only for reference material to the people who are ultimately producing the end product, which is writers. This is what the feed looks like when a game is run. And we try to run it, and we try to do it to the Darien calendar and then convert it back, but that's really complicated. So we basically run the games on the weekend of Mars, and then we actually post the stories on the weekend of our Earth present, but just 60 years in reverse. Anyhow, it's really great. I have guys that actually want to work on this because they're pretty tired of the stuff they do. And they're using all of the skills that they intrinsically have from their professions. And that's the part that I love. I love that we live in a time that we can legitimately get access to all the things to produce products like this, to design things, to assume as storytellers what may happen to technology that would allow us to do these things. All of this resulting in stuff that, one, is highly gratifying, and two, the type of feedback that I've been getting from both media, friends, has been extremely positive. And that, to me, is the most, that's the best metric ever. Because I respect these people. I mean, if there was such a thing as an unlike button, and I was getting a lot of unlikes, it would hurt me. But it would hurt me more for some of my friends who are working in Hollywood or working at shoe companies to say, man, that stuff's dumb. But they don't. And I don't take their favors to help me on this because their work is way too valuable. But the only goal that I have is that one day I will have enough of momentum that they can do a piece or they can draw something for one of the articles. So the process, as you see, is roughly linear. I have to brief writers, I have to brief everybody on a weekly basis. I have to get the code going and updated. So it does resemble the processes, but it's very nonlinear. I sometimes compare myself more to what chefs do than I do now to what I did as a designer. And what I mean by that is because I'm the primary cooker in my home, you know, I can cook everything from a really shitty quick meal to something that's extremely elaborate and decadent and multi-course that I have to spend a lot of time planning out to get all the dishes out at the same time. And I actually think that that is, since I won't be designing forever, this is probably the last type of design I'll do when I am done. And when I look at the problems that we have, you know, you can sometimes make up for a bad dinner with an amazing dessert. So where we put our design effort, where we put the priorities, isn't necessarily what we always think it is. And I like to think that being able to be objective and being able to be honest about looking for those problems really enables us all to be better designers. So rather than just worrying about the process, be confident that we can build the process if we find the right problems. That's pretty much all I had to say about this. So thank you very much, and please don't take off because there's prizes.